pupils. Now I'm going to discuss the white and gray matter of the spinal cord, as well as ascending and descending tracts. If you watched the last video, I discussed about the external features of the spinal cord. Today I'm going to discuss the internal features of the spinal cord. And as you are all aware that spinal cord, is similar to the brain. The brain has both gray and the white matter within it. Similarly, the spinal cord also has gray and white matter. But the only difference between the spinal cord and the brain, the white matter with regard to the spinal cord is, outside, while the gray matter is inside. Unlike in the brain, the gray matter is outside, forming the cerebral cortex, and the white matter is inside. So if you now take a cross-section of the spinal cord, at different level, that means at the cervical region, at the thoracic region, at the lumbar region, obviously the spinal cord at each level, there are some differences at each level. So this is just typically the typical section of the spinal cord at the level of the thoracic region. So as I said earlier, the spinal cord, if you now take that transverse section, and then you now pass a longitudinal plane, so you are going to divide the spinal cord into two halves. You have the left half, and then you have the right half. So that means the spinal cord, by the time you imagine an imaginary longitudinal plane, you divide it into two symmetrical halves. So you are going to see that, we have one septum that divides the spinal cord from the posterior aspect into two like this. In the anterior aspect, we don't have the septum, but we have the fissure. And this fissure also almost divides the spinal cord anteriorly into two, left and the right. And this is what is known as anterior median fissure. So anteriorly we have a fissure, which is a deeper groove, while posteriorly we have a septum. That means a partition, that divides the spinal cord. The spinal cord, if you now look at the gray matter of the spinal cord, the gray matter that is located within the substance of the white matter of the spinal cord, it has a shape of a butterfly. You have on this limb, you have what we call posterior horn and anterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So on either side, you have posterior horn of the spinal cord, you have anterior horn of the spinal cord. And then this horizontal bar, in the center of this horizontal bar of the gray matter, you have the central canal, through which the CSF now passes through. And if you can remember, in the brainstem, we have the aqueduct of Sylvius that connects directly or continues into this, central canal of the spinal cord. So this central canal of the gray matter of the spinal cord, by doing like this, so you have a gray matter that is lying anterior to this, central canal, and this is what is called, or what is known as, anterior commissure of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And similarly, posteriorly, you have a sheet of gray matter behind the central canal, and that is what is also known as posterior gray matter, or posterior gray commissure of the spinal cord. So you have anterior gray commissure, you also have posterior gray commissure of the spinal cord, each of this line anterior and posterior to the central canal respectively. And also you have a sheet of white matter, lying anterior to this, gray commissure. Since this white matter, that is lying anterior to this horizontal bar of the gray matter of the spinal cord, this is what is known as anterior white commissure. So now you are going to see that the white matter of the spinal cord, is being divided into three columns. You have posterior column, you have lateral column, and then you have anterior column. So this area is called the posterior column of the spinal cord, or dorsal column of the spinal cord. So the lateral column of the white matter, this one lies between the posterior horn of the spinal cord and the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And so this area is what is known as the lateral white matter or lateral funiculus. So you can as well call this posterior column or dorsal column. You can also call it posterior or dorsal funiculus. While on the lateral side, this lateral white matter of the spinal cord that is lying between the posterior horn and the anterior horn, you can call it lateral funiculus. And similarly, anteriorly here, this white matter bundle that is lying anterior to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, this is known as anterior funiculus or anterior white matter of the spinal cord. So now we've seen the classifications of the white matter, and so we can now see what are the structures that are lying within the gray matter or within the white matter of the spinal cord. So if we now take, for example, the posterior column or the posterior funiculus of the spinal cord, in this posterior funiculus, if we now take this left section, left side of the spinal cord, here I try to make the diagrams, for people to see. And so the posterior column or posterior funiculus of the spinal cord or dorsal column of the spinal cord, it has been divided into two parts by a septum by a sulcus known as posterior lateral sulcus. So this is a posterior lateral sulcus that divides the dorsal column into two parts. The medial part of this dorsal funiculus or dorsal column of the spinal cord, this is what is called fasciculus gracilis. And the other division lying lateral to this is known as, fasciculus cuneatus. So we have fasciculus gracilis lying on the medial side. We also have fasciculus cuneatus lying on the lateral side. These two fasciculi, they carry conscious proprioception from all part of the body, and then the information passes, into the brainstem, and then from there, the proprioceptive information is been taken to the postcentral gyrus. So now we've seen that the posterior column of the spinal cord is purely sensory. So it carries sensory information. And this sensory information is to do with conscious proprioception. So it's been taken through this fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. On the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord, we have, the ascending and descending tracts. Here in the posterior funiculus, they are all ascending tracts. While on the lateral side here, on the lateral funiculus, we have both ascending and descending tracts. So on the most lateral aspect of this lateral funiculus, the one that is lying on the lateral side, we have the posterior spinocerebellar tract and the anterior spinocerebellar tract. So we have posterior spinocerebellar tract, we have anterior spinocerebellar tracts. You can remember while I was discussing cerebellum in the previous video, I discussed about these two tracts. And these two tracts, if you watch the video, I discussed about them. They carry unconscious proprioceptive information from different parts of the body. And so this posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tract, they carry unconscious proprioceptive information from different parts of the body, while these two tracts that I said before, lying in the posterior column of the spinal cord, they carry conscious proprioceptive information from our own body. Similarly, still on the lateral funiculus, we have the descendant tracts. The most important descendant tract, on the lateral funiculus is the lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract, if you can remember from the cerebral cortex, information to initiate a motor movement comes from the cerebral cortex and the information passes through the internal capsule through the brainstem down to the spinal cord. So at the level of the medulla oblongata, if you can remember, while I was discussing the brainstem, at the level where I was discussing the medulla oblongata, I discussed about the pyramidal decussation there, whereby the right crosses to the left and the left, corticospinal and corticobulbar, they cross to the right. So there was a pyramidal decussation at the level of the medulla oblongata, so much so that 80 to 85% of this corticospinal fibers or tract, they crisscross to the other side as what is known as lateral corticospinal tract, carrying motor information to our own, muscles. The other 15 to 20% of these corticospinal fibers, they go undecussated. And so this one lies in the anterior side of the spinal cord, within the anterior funiculus of the spinal cord. And so this anterior corticospinal tract lies, close to the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. That is for the descending, corticospinal tract, both anterior and the lateral. So there are also two important tracts, and these two important tracts, they are known as extrapyramidal tracts. These extrapyramidal tracts, lying anterior to the lateral corticospinal tract, they are, the rubrospinal tract lying lateral to the other one, that is the lateral reticulospinal tract. And so we have rubrospinal tract, from the red nucleus down to the spinal cord and then to our muscles. Similarly, this lateral corticospinal tract from the reticular activating system or from the reticular formation, the fibers descend down into the spinal cord. So this reticulospinal tract, there are two. We have one on the lateral side in the lateral funiculus, and then we have another one that is lying in the anterior white column or anterior funiculus of the spinal cord. So we have the medial reticulospinal tract lying directly behind the anterior corticospinal tract, and then we have the lateral reticulospinal tract lying medial to the rubrospinal tract. All these, extrapyramidal fibers, they are responsible for the control of our, motor movement, especially the involuntary motor movement. So lying, anterior to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, we have the ascending tract. So we have what is known as anterior spinothalamic tract, and lying lateral to this is the lateral spinothalamic tract. Remember that both the anterior and the lateral spinothalamic tracts, they carry other sensory information ranging from the crude touch and pressure, as well as pain and temperature. So the lateral spinothalamic tract, if you can remember, carries information with regard to the pain and temperature, while the anterior spinothalamic tract carries the information for the crude touch and pressure. And remember that the lateral spinothalamic tract, crisscross to both the lateral and the anterior spinothalamic tract crisscross to the opposite side. So the two together, the fibers come from the right side, so they crisscross to this, left side, and those of the left carrying information from the other side of the body, they crisscross to the right part of the spinal cord. So similarly, on the anterior aspect of the anterior funiculus or anterior white matter of the spinal cord, we have other, ascending tracts and descending tracts. So there is one tract that is lying, medial to the anterior spinocerebellar tract, and this is what is known as spino olivary tract. This spino olivary tract is also responsible for, carrying proprioceptive information. And then medial again to this spino olivary tract is the vestibulospinal tract. The vestibulospinal tract is responsible for the balancing, of our own body, together with the maintenance of our posture. Remember that at the level of the pontomedullary junction, we have our vestibular nuclear apparatus, vestibular nuclear complex. And so from that vestibular nuclear complex present within the pons and also part of the medulla, these fibers descend from that nuclear complex down to the spinal cord, and that is what is known as vestibulospinal tract, responsible for maintenance of balance and equilibrium. Similarly, medial to this vestibulospinal tract, still in the anterior right corner of the spinal cord, we have tectospinal tract. The tectospinal tract is, if you can remember, in the midbrain we have the tectum. So in the tectum there, we have fibers descending to the spinal cord, and this tectospinal tract is responsible for the reflex movement of our own head with regard to the audio or visual stimuli. In the posterior horn of the spinal cord, there are 4 groups of nuclei there, located from before backward. So from the posterior side, the most posterior among this group of nuclei in the posterior horn of the spinal cord, there is what is known as substantia gelatinosa. The substantia gelatinosa, is responsible for carrying information, all the, nerve fibers responsible for carrying information for pain and temperature. So for pain and temperature, this nucleus, the second order neuron, begins from the substantia gelatinosa, while the first order neuron is from the dorsal root, is within the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal cord. So from the substantia gelatinosa, this second order neuron now crisscross to the opposite side to form either the anterior or the lateral spinothalamic tract, but mainly it forms the lateral spinothalamic tract that is responsible for the pain and temperature. The second nucleus is nucleus proprius. This nucleus proprius lies anterior to the substantia gelatinosa, and this nucleus proprius now is also responsible for carrying information regarding touch and pressure. And so if you can remember, I said that the anterior spinothalamic tract carries information responsible for touch, crude touch and pressure, and so the second order neuron for this anterior spinothalamic tract begins from the nucleus proprius. So now you can see that the anterior spinothalamic tract has its own second neuron in the nucleus proprius, while the lateral spinothalamic tract has its own second order neuron from the substantia gelatinosa. So the other nucleus, what is known as the Clark's nucleus, this Clark's nucleus lies anterior to the nucleus proprius, and this one now is responsible for carrying information with regard to the unconscious proprioception. That means something to do with our posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts. Remember, I said that the spinocerebellar tracts, they carry unconscious proprioceptive information from our own part of the body, and then finally it reaches the cerebellum. And so this second order neuron of this anterior and posterior spinocerebellar tract begins from the Clark's nucleus. The other one, that is the fourth one, it lies anterior lateral to the Clark's nucleus, and this is what is known as visceral nucleus. So this visceral nucleus now carries, viscerosomatic information from our own internal organs, something like the lungs, the internal organs like gastrointestinal tracts, liver, and so on and so forth. So all this visceral information from our internal organs, they have been carried, to this, visceral nucleus, and so the information has been taken up within the, spinal cord, and before it finally gets into the somatosensory area. So at the level of the thoracic and the lumbar region of the spinal cord, we have what is known as lateral horn of the spinal cord. So you remember, you can only get this lateral horn at the level of T1 down to the level of L1, L2 of the spinal cord. Reason because this one is responsible for the sympathetic, response in our own body. So the lateral horn cell now can only be seen when you now take a cross section of the spinal cord at the level of the thoracic and the lumbar region. Here you can see that there are 3 groups of nuclei. The anterior horn cells is supposed to say that is divided into 3 groups of nuclei. You have the medial group, the central group, and the lateral group. The lateral group nuclei now can only be found at the level of the cervical region and at the level of the lumbar region. Reason because at the cervical region, we have, brachial plexus responsible for the supply of the upper lip. And so you can see this lateral group, well marked at the level of the cervical region of the spinal cord. This central group nuclei at the cervical region now, because we have phrenic nerve, C3, C4, C5. So the phrenic nerve takes its own, nuclei, takes its own fibers from this central group. Similarly, we have accessory part of the spinal accessory nerve, of the 11th cranial nerve. Remember that the 11th cranial nerve, that is the accessory nerve, it has a cranial part and a spinal part. The spinal part of the 11th cranial nerve, takes its own fibers from the central group nuclei. So apart from the phrenic nerve, C3, C4, at the level of the cervical region, you also have the spinal part of the accessory nerve, that is the 11th cranial nerve. So again, you can also have some nuclei, you can also have some the fibers for the sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers, for our autonomic function. They also take their own, fibers, from, the central group nuclei. While the medial group can be found, throughout, the length of the spinal cord. Reason because this is responsible for the supply of musculature of the neck and the trunk. So in the neck, we have a neck musculature. So you can see this medial group at the level of the cervical region of the spinal cord. And so also in the trunk, especially the thorax, we have the intercostal muscles. And so you can also see this medial group of the nuclei in the anterior horn of the spinal cord at that level. Similarly, the abdominal muscles, both anterior and posterior abdominal wall muscles, at the level of the lumbar region. So also at the lumbar region, you can also see, this medial group of nuclei when you now take a cross-section of that, spinal cord. So by and large, actually, this is, in brief, the ascending and descending tracts of the spinal cord, as well as the group of nuclei that are found within the gray matter of the spinal cord. And I'm sure students will be able to explain the importance of each of these nuclei, as well as the function of each and every, descending or ascending tracts that are found within the white matter of the spinal cord.